Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're going to plunge headfirst into the amazing world of ecology.
I like it. Plunge head first.
Yeah, but we're going deeper than just the basics, right? We're not going to bore our listeners with stuff they already know. This time, we've got a really fascinating set of research all about the connections and interactions that make up, well, life.
Yeah, it's really all about relationships, how everything is interconnected, how every organism fits into this giant puzzle we call an ecosystem.
Exactly. So let's start with the foundation. What even is ecology?
Good question. Ecology is it's the study of how organisms interact with each other and their environment. It's a giant puzzle where each living thing has its own place and role.
Right. So we all know what an organism is, but how does that fit into the bigger picture?
Well, think about a group of individuals, all the same species, all living in the same area. They share resources. They interbreed. That's a population, like a pack of wolves or a school of fish. Or, think about a field of wildflowers all swaying in the breeze.
So it's more than just one individual. It's a whole group of them interacting with each other.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
But what makes each population special? How do ecologists even study these things?
Each population has its own unique characteristics, characteristics that individuals don't have.
Like what? Give me an example.
Like birth weights and death rates.
Yeah.
Or the ratio of males to females in a population. We can even look at the age distribution. How many youngsters versus old-timers. It's like a demographic snapshot of the whole population.
Ooh, that's cool. But how do you even figure out those rates? How do you calculate the birth rate of a whole school of fish? Sounds tricky.
Well, it can be. Let's take an example from the research you provided. Remember those lotus plants? That was a fascinating study.
I love that one.
Right. So let's say you start with 20 lotus plants in a pond. Over a year, 8 new plants sprout up. To get the birth rate, you divide those 8 new plants by the original 20. That gives you a birth rate of 0.4 offspring per lotus plant each year.
That makes sense. And death rates would work the same way, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Just count how many individuals die during that same period. And you mentioned age distribution. That's where those age pyramids come in. They visually show how many individuals are in each age group. So a pyramid with a wide base, meaning lots of youngsters, means the population's probably going to grow fast in the future.
That's a great visual. I can totally picture that. So a population with lots of young folks is headed for a baby boom. Mm-hmm. And a population with mostly older individuals, well, they might shrink over time.
Right. Makes sense. Right.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so we've talked about birth and death rates, age structure. But what about the actual number of individuals? Population size, I guess you'd call it.
Huh?
How do you even begin to measure that? Imagine trying to count every single ant in an anthill.
You're hitting on a really important point. Measuring population size, or what we call population density, it can be super challenging. Sometimes, you can just count the individuals like researchers do with those endangered Siberian cranes. Their populations can be less than 10 birds. So you got to know where each one is.
Wow, that's a tiny population.
Mm.
So direct counting works for small populations, but what about for those bigger, harder to count groups?
Then we have to get a little more creative. We might use things like percent cover. That tells you how much of an area a species occupies, like how much of a forest floor is covered in ferns. Or sometimes we measure biomass, which is, the total weight of the population. That's useful when you're comparing a giant banyan tree to a field of grass.
Ah, that's a good point. Counting the number of trees wouldn't really give you the full picture of their impact. So it's not just about counting individuals, it's about understanding their influence on the ecosystem.
Mm.
But knowing the size of a population is only one piece of the puzzle, right? What about how these populations actually change over time?
Exactly. That's the dynamic part. Populations aren't static. They're constantly growing, shrinking, shifting, responding to all sorts of factors in their environment.
So like food availability, predators, competition, maybe even things like weather and disease, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. It's all connected. To try and understand all of that, ecologists use these 2 main models of population growth: exponential growth and logistic growth.
Okay, let's break those down. What's exponential growth all about?
Imagine, the perfect world for any species. Unlimited resources, no predators, perfect weather. In that scenario, a population could grow exponentially. Every single individual would reproduce to their full potential, and nothing would hold them back.
Wow, that sounds like a population explosion. But is that even realistic? In the real world, there are always limits, right? Resources run out, predators show up.
You're right. Exponential growth is more of a theoretical idea. It's a way to understand a population's potential for growth. Think about bacteria, right? They can double their population every hour under ideal conditions.
Ah, okay. It helps us understand how quickly a population could grow if everything was perfect.
Yeah, exactly. Even Darwin himself talked about this, using elephants as an example. He said that if elephants had unlimited resources and no predators, their population would skyrocket over time.
Okay, so exponential growth is all about understanding the power of unrestrained growth, even if it rarely happens in nature. Is there a way to represent that mathematically, like with an equation?
Oh, yeah, there is. We use the equation dn dt equals rn. In this
Hmm.
equation, n is the population size, t is time, and r is the intrinsic rate of natural increase. Basically, that little r tells you how quickly a population can grow under ideal conditions.
So a higher R value means faster growth. Yeah, I got it. But you mentioned that in the real world, resources are almost always limited. So what happens to populations when they hit those limits?
That's where logistic growth comes in. It's a more realistic model because it takes into account the carrying capacity of an environment.
Carrying capacity, what does that mean exactly?
It's kind of like a population ceiling, you know?
Yeah.
It's the maximum number of individuals that specific environment can sustainably support.
That makes sense. It's like filling a glass with water. You can pour really fast at first, but as the glass gets full, you got to slow down or it'll spill over.
Exactly. Logistic growth recognizes those natural limits that exist in every ecosystem. It's essential for understanding how populations actually behave in the real world.
Okay, so we've gone from the theoretical population explosion of exponential growth to the more realistic limits of logistic growth. This is really fascinating stuff.
Right. And it's super important, especially when we think about things like human population growth and the availability of resources like food, water, and energy. Those are finite resources.
Absolutely. We're all part of this giant ecological web, and understanding these concepts helps us see how everything is connected.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We started with the basics of ecology, defined populations, and even explored how those populations grow and change over time.
And we're just getting started. There's still so much to uncover, like how organisms have evolved, these crazy cool strategies to survive, and the web of relationships that link all these different species together.
I'm ready for more. Let's keep diving deeper.
You know, it's just incredible how organisms have evolved these different strategies to make a living in their environments. Like nature's always experimenting with ways to survive and reproduce.
Yeah, there's so much diversity out there. It's mind-boggling when you really think about it. So you're talking about those life history strategies, right? Like, what are some examples of these different approaches?
Let's start with something from your research. The Pacific salmon.
Oh, yeah. Those epic migrations are amazing.
Right, these fish swim hundreds of miles upstream to their spawning grounds. And get this, they reproduce only once in their lifetime, and then they die. It's a pretty dramatic strategy.
Wow, talk about going all in on reproduction. I mean, wouldn't it make more sense to reproduce multiple times and spread the risk a bit?
You'd think so, right. But it all comes down to maximizing their fitness in their specific environment. That one massive reproductive event allows them to, exploit a resource-rich environment and produce a ton of offspring.
So it's all about maximizing their chances of passing on their genes, even if it means sacrificing a longer lifespan. It's fascinating how evolution has shaped these different approaches.
It really is. Okay, so contrast that salmon strategy with, say, mammals. Most mammals have multiple breeding events throughout their lives, right?
Right. Like us humans, we don't just have one shot at reproduction.
Exactly. And that allows mammals to invest more time and energy in raising their offspring, giving them a better chance of survival.
So it's like the salmon are going for quantity, while mammals are focusing on quality. Both valid strategies, just different approaches. Are there other variations on this theme?
Oh, tons. Think about oysters. They release millions of tiny larvae into the ocean, but only a tiny fraction of those will actually survive to adulthood.
It's a numbers game then. High mortality, but the potential for wide dispersal.
Exactly. Then you have species that take the opposite approach. They invest heavily in just a few offspring.
Like birds, right. They lay a small number of relatively large eggs, and then they provide a lot of parental care.
Right on. Birds are a classic example. It's all about quality over quantity, making sure those few offspring have the best possible chance of survival.
This is all so fascinating. It really highlights that there's no single right way to reproduce. It's all about finding a strategy that works in a particular environment. But We've been focusing on single populations so far. What happens when different populations start interacting with each other?
Now you're getting to the heart of ecology. The natural world isn't just a bunch of isolated populations, right? It's all about these interactions, these relationships between different species.
So it's like a giant ecological dance floor, with everyone trying to find their place and survive. What are some of the ways that these different species can interact with each other?
Well, imagine a spectrum of relationships, right? From fierce competition to win-win cooperation.
Okay, that makes sense. So on one end of the spectrum, you have species fighting for the same resources.
Exactly. We call that competition. It can be pretty intense. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have species that actually benefit from each other's presence. We call that mutualism.
Ah, so it's not always a battle. Sometimes species can work together. Okay, let's start with the dramatic stuff, predation. I mean, lions hunting zebras is a pretty classic example, but what's the ecological role of predators? What's their purpose?
Predation is more than just the thrilling chase. It's this fundamental process that drives energy transfer through ecosystems. It's like nature's way of channeling the energy captured by plants up through the food chain.
So it's all about energy flow. Predators are like the energy movers of the ecosystem. But it's still a bit harsh, right? I mean, predators basically kill and eat other animals.
True, but it's not just about death and destruction. Predators actually play a crucial role in keeping prey populations in check. Without predators, certain species could explode in numbers, and that would throw the whole ecosystem out of balance.
So they're kind of like the natural population control officers, keeping things in order. Are there any real-world examples of this, like from the research we've been looking at?
Remember that article about the prickly pear cactus in Australia?
Oh, yeah. That was a crazy story. It basically took over huge areas of land. It became a real problem.
Exactly. And it was all because the prickly pear cactus was introduced to Australia without any of its natural predators. It had no enemies. So, to combat this invasion, scientists decided to introduce a moth from the cactus's native habitat.
A moth. That doesn't sound very intimidating.
Well, this moth is a natural predator of the prickly pear cactus. It basically feasts on the cactus, and guess what? It worked. The moth helped to bring the cactus population under control, restoring balance to the ecosystem.
Wow, that's incredible. So predators can be a powerful tool for managing invasive species. It's like a natural form of pest control.
Exactly. And you know what else? Predators also play a big role in maintaining biodiversity. By keeping any one species from becoming too dominant, they create space and resources for other species to thrive.
So they're not just controlling populations, they're actually promoting diversity. That's pretty cool.
It really is. Okay, now let's shift gears a bit and talk about competition. It's another major type of interaction between species, and it can be pretty intense.
Yeah, competition. I think we can all relate to that. So what's the ecological definition of competition?
It basically happens when two or more species need the same limited resources, things like food, water, shelter, sunlight. It's a constant struggle for survival.
Right, survival of the fittest. So in these competitive situations, does one species always end up wiping out the other?
That's a great question. There's this idea called the competitive exclusion principle. It basically says that two species competing for the exact same resources can't coexist forever. One of them will eventually win out and eliminate the other.
Wow, that sounds pretty dramatic. But I have a feeling that nature often finds ways to avoid that kind of winner-take-all scenario, right?
You're absolutely right. While competition can be fierce, it doesn't always lead to extinction. Over time, species can evolve ways to coexist. They figure out ways to share the resources. We call this resource partitioning.
Resource partitioning. Okay, tell me more about that. How does it work?
Imagine a group of birds all living in the same forest and all feeding on insects. Instead of competing for every single insect, they might specialize. Some birds might focus on catching insects in the air, while others glean insects from the leaves.
I see. So they divide up the resources, each specializing in a slightly different way.
Exactly. It's all about reducing that direct competition and finding ways to share the ecological pie, so to speak. There was this classic study by Robert MacArthur on warblers in North America. He found that 5 different warbler species, all eating insects, were able to coexist in the same trees.
5 different species in the same trees. How did they manage that?
By dividing up the foraging space. Each warbly species specialized in a different part of the tree, effectively reducing competition.
That's amazing. They each found their own little niche within the forest. It's a testament to the adaptability of life and the incredible ways that evolution shapes these interactions.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, so we've talked about predation and competition, two pretty intense interactions. But remember those other types of interactions we mentioned, parasitism and commensalism.
Yeah, we can't forget about those.
Yeah.
They each have their own fascinating stories to tell, right?
Absolutely. They add even more layers to the complexity of ecological interactions, and we'll dive into those next.
Okay, let's talk about those other interactions. Parasitism and commensalism. Parasitism, I gotta admit, it always kind of creeps me out.
I get it. But it's honestly super interesting when you think about it. Parasites have evolved this strategy where they get free food and shelter, right?
Right.
But it comes at a cost for the other organism, the host.
Yeah, it's kind of like having a roommate who never pays rent and eats all your food.
Yeah.
But how do parasites actually pull this off? How do they live off their hosts?
Well, they've got some amazing adaptations. Some parasites, like ticks or lice, live on their host. We call those ectoparasites. But others, like the malaria parasite, live inside their host. Those are endoparasites.
I can see the appeal of being an endoparasite. Constant food supply, protection from the elements. Sounds cozy, but don't the hosts fight back?
Oh, absolutely. Hosts have their own defenses, their immune systems can target and destroy parasites, and they can even change their behavior to avoid getting infected in the first place. It's a constant evolutionary arms race, really.
It's like a never-ending battle between the parasite and the host.
Yeah.
Are there any particularly crazy examples of parasitism, like anything that really stands out?
One that always blows my mind is brood parasitism in birds. I remember reading about the cuckoo.
Oh, yeah. The cuckoo, the bird that lays its eggs in other birds' nests. Sneaky little birds.
Right. They trick other birds into raising their young. And it's not just about laying the eggs either. Cuckoo eggs often look just like the host's eggs, so they're harder to spot. And then, get this, the cuckoo chicks often hatch first, and sometimes even push the host's eggs out of the nest.
Wow, that's both amazing and kind of brutal. Nature can be pretty ruthless.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's parasitism. What about commensalism? You said that's where one species benefits and the other one is neither harmed nor helped.
Right. It's like a free ride for one of the species. Classic example is the cattle egret and, well, cattle.
I've seen those. The birds hang out around the cows. Why do they do that?
As the cattle graze, they stir up insects, right? The egrets follow along and snatch up those insects for an easy meal. The cows aren't bothered at all.
So it's a win for the egrets, and the cows are just, like, oblivious. Are there any other examples of commensalism?
Oh, tons. Think about those barnacles that attach themselves to whales. They get a free ride to food-rich waters and don't have to expend any energy to get there.
That's like having a built-in cruise ship. Okay, so we've covered predation, competition, parasitism, commensalism. What about that win-win interaction? The one where both species benefit.
Ah, yes. Mutualism. One of the best examples is the relationship between flowering plants and their pollinators.
The birds and the bees, we all learn about that in elementary school.
Yeah.
But how does this benefit both the plants and the pollinators?
It's a beautiful exchange, really. Plants need pollinators to carry pollen from one flower to another. That's how they reproduce. And in return, pollinators get nectar, which is basically sugar water, and often some pollen, too, which gives them protein and other nutrients.
So it's a mutually beneficial trade agreement. They each get something they need. Are there other examples of mutualism that show this kind of cooperation?
Oh, for sure. There are these certain ants that live in the hollow thorns of acacia trees. They protect the trees from herbivores, and in return, the trees provide the ants with food and shelter.
Wow, they've got a real partnership going on. Each one relies on the other. It's amazing how these interactions show how interconnected life really is. It's not always about competition. Sometimes cooperation is the key to success.
Exactly. And there are so many more examples out there. Nature's full of surprises. It just goes to show you there are many different paths to success in the game of life.
Well, this deep dive into ecology has been incredible. We've covered so much ground today, from populations to interactions to strategies for survival. It's really fascinating stuff.
I agree. And the best part is we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more out there to discover about the natural world.
So, to all you deep divers out there, here's your challenge. Take a look around you. What ecological interactions can you spot in your backyard, in a park, even just outside your window? Once you start paying attention, you'll be amazed at the intricate web of life that's unfolding all around us. That's the beauty of ecology. It's a science we can all participate in. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep discovering those wonders of the natural world.